The flood's rising. Someone help, she cried. A scout pulled her close as water raged down the trail. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was the kind of storm that made the mountains seem alive with fury. The rain had been falling relentlessly for hours, turning the once peaceful trail into a rushing river of mud and debris. Sarah had been making her way back to the town after a long day's journey through the wilderness, the sky darkening above her with each passing moment. She had known the storm was coming, but nothing could have prepared her for how fast the floodwaters would rise. She tried to quicken her pace, but the earth beneath her feet was slick and treacherous, each step more difficult than the last. As the wind howled through the trees and the rain soaked through her clothes, Sarah's heart raced. Her thoughts turned to her family, her father, her mother, and her younger brother back at home, wondering if they were safe. She had no way of knowing how much time she had left before the water swallowed the trail entirely. Then, the worst happened. As Sarah tried to make her way around a bend in the path, the ground gave way beneath her feet. In an instant, the floodwaters surged forward, pushing her off her feet and pulling her into the fast-moving current. Panic surged through her chest as she gasped for air, her body being pulled further into the raging water. Her arms flailed as she tried to find something to grab onto, anything to keep her from being swept away. She could hear the sound of the river roaring in her ears, drowning out all other noise. Just as she thought she couldn't hold on any longer, she felt a strong hand grip her arm. With a forceful tug, the hand pulled her up, away from the deadly current. The world around her spun as she was yanked to safety, her legs barely able to keep up with the strength of the pull. Hold on. You're all right now, a calm voice said, his words barely audible over the roar of the flood. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she looked up to see the man who had saved her. He was a scout, tall and sturdy, with a weathered face that told of years spent in the wild. His eyes were calm, yet full of determination. She could barely make out his features through the rain, but his presence was a beacon of hope in the storm. The scout dragged her closer to a large tree, the only shelter they could find. As they huddled together, the water raged down the trail, growing stronger by the minute. Sarah looked at him, her voice shaky. How did you know I was here? The scout's lips pressed into a tight line as he scanned the area around them. I was tracking the storm, he said. I knew the river was rising fast. It's a good thing I found you when I did. There's no time to waste. He looked down at her. Stay close. We have to move. Sarah nodded, still trembling from the cold and fear. The scout helped her to her feet, and they moved quickly, the floodwaters threatening to overtake them at every step. They had to cross the river again, but this time they would do it together. With every step they took, Sarah couldn't help but feel a strange sense of gratitude for this stranger who had pulled her from certain death. She didn't know who he was or why he had come to her aid, but in that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that he was there and they were alive. As they pushed forward, the storm raged on, but Sarah knew one thing for certain. This scout, this quiet warrior, would be her protector in the storm. The scout gripped Sarah's arm tightly as he helped her scramble to her feet, the rain still pouring down in sheets. The world around them was a blur of water, mud, and howling wind. She could barely catch her breath, her heart still racing from the terror of being swept away. But the scout didn't give her a moment to pause. He motioned urgently toward the tree that had provided them shelter from the worst of the flood. We need to keep moving, he said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. The water's rising faster than I expected. Sarah nodded, her legs unsteady as she tried to follow him, but her body felt like it was made of stone. The cold had seeped into her bones, and she could still feel the rush of the floodwater, the way it had pulled at her, like nature itself had wanted to take her. The scout was already leading the way, wading through the mud with ease. His movements were deliberate, practiced, as though he had navigated storms like this his whole life. He turned to her. Stay close. I'll get us to higher ground. Sarah nodded again, her throat tight. Thank you, she whispered, but he didn't respond. just focused on the path ahead. The rain fell in relentless sheets, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees, but they pressed on. Every step felt heavier than the last as Sarah fought to keep up, her feet slipping in the mud, her body aching from exhaustion. She was no stranger to hardship, but this was different. This was survival, pure and simple. The scout never looked back, always moving forward, always leading the way. They reached a small rise in the land, a patch of dry ground where the floodwaters had yet to reach. Sarah could see the water swirling just a few feet below them, churning and rushing along the trail they had just passed. The storm was only getting worse, and they couldn't afford to stay where they were. The scout didn't wait for her to catch her breath. He grabbed her hand and began pulling her forward again, moving toward the ridge where he'd spotted a better vantage point. As they moved, Sarah's mind raced. Who was this man? Why had he saved her? She had no idea who he was, but something about him made her feel like she could trust him. She didn't know where they were going, but it didn't matter. He was guiding her, and that was all that mattered. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. He glanced at her for a moment, his face hard to read in the dim light. "Gabe," he said simply, before looking ahead again. She nodded, the name simple and unassuming. But something in the way he said it, so matter-of-factly, made her feel like it was more than just a name. They reached the ridge, and Gabe stopped to survey the landscape below. The water was rising quickly, the path they had just traveled already swallowed by the flood. Sarah's stomach dropped at the sight. "We have to get out of here," she said, her voice trembling. Gabe nodded, his jaw set. "I know. We'll head for the cabin up ahead. It's not far." She didn't question him. She had to trust him, even if she didn't fully understand why. They moved again, this time faster, the rain soaking them both as they made their way toward the cabin he had mentioned. Every step felt like it could be their last, but Gabe's presence gave her a strange sense of calm. He was in control, and that made all the difference. As they neared the cabin, Sarah could see that it was small, barely more than a shack, but it would provide shelter from the storm. The flood had already reached the edge of the clearing, and the water was rising fast. They had no time to lose. Gabe pushed open the door, and they both rushed inside, slamming it shut behind them just as the water surged forward, threatening to swallow them whole. Inside, the cabin was dim, but it was dry. A small fire burned in the hearth, the only light in the room. Sarah collapsed onto a chair near the fire, her breath coming in short gasps. She couldn't believe they had made it. Gabe moved to the window, his eyes scanning the storm outside. "We're safe for now," he said, though his tone was far from reassuring. Sarah looked at him, the reality of the situation sinking in. She had survived, yes, but they were far from out of danger. "What now?" she asked. Gabe turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Now we wait," he said simply. "The storm won't last forever, but we need to be ready." Sarah nodded, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time since the flood had started, she allowed herself to close her eyes, just for a moment, and breathe. She was safe, at least for now. "I told you we need to wait," Gabe said, his voice low and firm, as he continued to stand near the window, keeping an eye on the storm. Sarah sat in front of the fire, her eyes fixed on the flames, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't control. It had been hours since they arrived at the small cabin, the storm still howling outside like a beast in a rage, but inside, it was strangely calm. The flickering fire provided the only warmth in the cabin, and despite the overwhelming fear she had felt earlier, Sarah's body finally began to relax. But she wasn't sure how long that would last. The water outside continued to rise, creeping closer to the small cabin with every passing minute. Gabe had locked the door behind them, and the only light came from the fire and the occasional flash of lightning through the small window. Sarah knew that they couldn't stay in the cabin forever, but what choice did they have? Gabe hadn't spoken much since they arrived, and she had no idea how they were supposed to survive if the water kept rising like this. "What happens if the water keeps rising?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. She turned her head to look at Gabe, who still stood by the window, his back to her. His figure was outlined against the storm, tall and unyielding, as though he was waiting for something or someone. "We move," he replied simply, without turning to look at her. His words sent a chill through Sarah. "Move? How? There's no way out there." "We find a way," Gabe said, his voice steady, though there was something in the way he said it that didn't match the calmness of his tone. He was just as uncertain as she was, but he wasn't showing it. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, still shivering despite the warmth of the fire. The tension in the air seemed to be growing, and she couldn't help but feel the weight of her situation. What would they do if the storm didn't stop? What if the flood took everything? She looked at Gabe again, his face unreadable, but his eyes still scanning the outside world. There was something about him, something in the way he carried himself, that made her feel safe, even though they were in the middle of a life-threatening storm. He was a man of action, a man who knew what needed to be done. "Why did you help me?" she asked, unable to hold the question in any longer. Gabe finally turned to her, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in hours. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He didn't give her a direct answer, just studied her for a long, silent moment. Sarah could feel the weight of his gaze, the way he was analyzing her, as if trying to figure out whether or not to trust her. But she didn't look away, didn't shy from his stare. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "Because you were in trouble," he said simply, as if that was all the explanation she needed. She blinked, the simplicity of his answer catching her off guard. It wasn't what she expected. She had assumed there was more to it, some deeper reason why he had risked his life to save her. But it seemed that for Gabe, saving her was as simple as recognizing that she needed help. "You would have done the same for anyone," Sarah said, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. Gabe didn't reply, but his expression softened for a brief moment, and Sarah could see the flicker of something else in his eyes, something that spoke of experience, of a life lived with decisions made in moments of crisis. He turned back to the window, the storm still raging outside, but for a second, there was a silence between them, a silent understanding that passed between them. They both knew that the storm wasn't over yet, but they also knew they had to be ready. Sarah stood up, walking slowly toward the window where Gabe stood, her feet still unsure beneath her. She joined him, looking out into the tempest, the darkness broken only by the occasional flashes of lightning. The world outside was chaos, but inside, there was a strange sense of peace. Gabe didn't say anything as she joined him at the window, but she could feel the connection between them. They were both survivors, both out here in the wild, with nothing but each other to rely on. They had no idea what would happen next, but they were in it together. "How long do you think the storm will last?" Sarah asked, her voice almost drowned out by the howling wind. Gabe's eyes remained on the storm, his jaw tight. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But we have to be ready for whatever comes next." Sarah nodded, though she still wasn't sure what he meant by that. What else could come after this? The flood was rising, and the storm had shown no signs of letting up. But she could tell that Gabe had something else in mind, something she wasn't yet seeing. They would have to survive, no matter what. Gabe stepped away from the window, turning to face her, his expression serious. "We'll wait until the storm breaks. After that, we move." Sarah nodded again, though doubt lingered in the back of her mind. She wasn't sure how they would move when the floodwaters had taken over, but for now, all she could do was trust Gabe. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to settle into the stillness, her body exhausted but her mind alert. The storm raged on, but they were safe, for now. And that had to be enough. The storm showed no signs of letting up. The wind howled through the small cabin, and the rain continued to pour down in torrents, battering the roof with a relentless fury. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and wood smoke, the fire crackling weakly in the hearth. Sarah sat by the window, staring out into the darkness, her mind racing. It had been hours since Gabe had led her to safety, but the floodwaters were still rising, and she could hear the constant rush of water outside, as if nature itself was determined to consume everything in its path. The flood had been brutal, but it wasn't the flood itself that worried Sarah, it was what came after. What would happen when the storm finally passed? Would the water recede, or would they be trapped here forever? Gabe hadn't given her many answers, only that they would move when the storm broke. But how? How could they survive in a world that had been swallowed by nature's rage? She turned away from the window and walked back to the fire, trying to warm her hands, but the chill in her bones wouldn't go away. Gabe was sitting by the door, cleaning his rifle with slow, methodical movements. His face was calm, but his eyes never stopped scanning the storm outside. He didn't seem worried, and that fact alone unsettled Sarah. He He was a man who had seen more than his fair share of hardship, she could tell. But she wasn't like him. She wasn't a survivor, not like Gabe. She had never been in a situation like this, and the weight of the unknown pressed down on her chest. "Gabe," she said softly, her voice carrying across the stillness of the cabin. "How do you stay so calm?" He glanced up at her, his dark eyes briefly meeting hers. "Because there's no other choice," he said, his voice steady, like the calm before a storm. "Worrying about what's coming won't change a thing. We just need to focus on what we can do right now." Sarah nodded, though his words didn't quite settle the storm in her mind. She sat down across from him, her hands still trembling slightly from the cold. "But how do you know what to do?" she asked. Gabe didn't answer immediately, his gaze returning to his rifle. He ran a rag over the barrel, his movements fluid, practiced. Finally, he spoke. "You just do what you have to do," he said quietly. "In situations like this, you don't have time for fear. Fear doesn't help you think. It just makes everything harder." Sarah absorbed his words, trying to understand. She had always been a person who relied on planning, on making sure everything was in place before moving forward. But here, there was no time for planning. There was only the flood, the storm, and the fight to survive. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You already are," Gabe replied, his voice firm. "You're still here, aren't you? That's the first step. Now, we just need to keep moving." The fire crackled again, the sound echoing in the quiet cabin. Sarah looked at Gabe, feeling a sense of gratitude stir inside her. He was strong, reliable, and steady, everything she needed in this storm. But she couldn't help feeling like she was holding him back. "I don't know how to survive like you," she said softly. Gabe finally put down his rifle and turned to face her, his expression softening just slightly. "You don't have to be like me," he said. "You just have to keep going. One step at a time. That's how we survive." His words were simple, but there was truth in them. Sarah didn't need to be a seasoned scout or a warrior to survive. She just had to keep moving forward, no matter how terrifying the unknown was. Gabe stood up, walking over to the window again. He peered out, his brow furrowing as he looked at the rising floodwaters. "We'll need to leave soon," he said, almost to himself. "The water's getting higher. We can't stay here much longer." Sarah's heart raced at the thought of leaving the cabin. The outside world was a terrifying unknown, and the flood had already proven how deadly it could be. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Gabe turned to her, his expression serious. "We're going to head for the high ground. There's a ridge not far from here. It'll be dangerous, but it's our best shot." Sarah swallowed hard, trying to push down the fear that was building in her chest. "How will we get there?" she asked. Gabe looked at her, his eyes steady. "We'll walk. We've got no other choice." He walked over to the door and opened it slowly, the storm's fury immediately rushing in. He turned to her one last time. "Are you ready?" Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. Gabe was right. They had no other choice. She nodded. "I'm ready." Together, they stepped out into the storm, the wind howling around them, the rain stinging their faces. The floodwaters surged around their ankles as they moved forward, the uncertainty of what lay ahead pressing down on them. But in that moment, Sarah knew one thing for sure. They were in this together, and no matter what happened, they would keep moving forward. The wind howled as Sarah and Gabe trudged through the torrential rain, the floodwaters surging around their legs. The storm seemed to have intensified since they left the cabin, the rain now coming down in sheets, each drop a sharp sting on their skin. The earth beneath them was soft, the mud slippery, and every step felt like a struggle. But they couldn't afford to slow down, not now. The floodwaters were rising quickly, and the high ground Gabe had mentioned was still a mile ahead. It was the only safe option left. Sarah glanced at Gabe, his face set in a determined mask, eyes scanning the horizon even as he moved steadily through the storm. His calm, steady presence was both reassuring and intimidating. She had never known a man so sure of himself, especially in the face of such danger. She, on the other hand, was filled with doubt and fear, though she tried not to show it. Her clothes clung to her body, soaked through by the relentless downpour. The weight of the waterlogged fabric made each movement harder, but she kept moving, focused on Gabe's lead. They passed through thick trees, their branches bending under the weight of the rain, the ground beneath them becoming increasingly unstable as the water level rose. The roar of the flood became louder as they drew closer to the ridge, a constant reminder of the danger they were in. Despite the chaos around them, Gabe never faltered, never hesitated. Sarah admired his resilience, but it only made her feel more like an outsider, someone who wasn't built for this kind of survival. How much farther? Sarah asked, her voice almost drowned by the wind. Gabe glanced at her briefly before turning his attention back to the path ahead. Not far, he replied, his voice calm, but she could hear the strain in it. Even he was feeling the weight of the storm. But they couldn't stop now. Just keep moving, he added, his voice steady. Sarah nodded, pushing through the exhaustion that was threatening to overtake her. Every part of her body screamed to stop, to rest, but she couldn't. Not with the flood closing in on them. Not with Gabe leading the way. They pushed on for what felt like hours, their progress slow but steady. The terrain grew more treacherous as they reached the ridge, the muddy ground giving way to rocks and uneven earth. Gabe moved with ease, like he was born for this kind of environment. Sarah, however, struggled to keep her footing, her legs trembling with the effort to keep up. Finally, they reached the edge of the ridge, and Sarah let out a sigh of relief. The view from here was breathtaking, the vast expanse of water stretching out below them. The flood had swallowed the land, turning everything in its path into a raging river. But the ridge was safe, for now. They were above the floodwaters, at least temporarily. Gabe took a moment to catch his breath, but his eyes never left the water below. We're safe here for now, he said, his voice low. But we can't stay long. The storm's not going to let up anytime soon. Sarah looked out at the flooded landscape, feeling a sense of awe mixed with fear. The storm had turned the world into something unrecognizable, a vast, unrelenting force that had taken everything in its path. But here, on this ridge, they were safe. For now. Gabe sat down on a nearby rock, pulling out a small, weathered map. Sarah joined him, her body trembling from the cold, but she didn't mind. She was alive, and that was all that mattered. Gabe studied the map, tracing his finger along the lines of the terrain. We'll need to move again once the storm clears, he said, his voice steady. There's a town about 10 miles from here. We can make it there if we move fast. Sarah nodded, though a part of her was still unsure. 10 miles was a long distance, and the storm had shown no signs of letting up. But if Gabe thought they could make it, then maybe they had a chance. What happens when we get to the town? She asked. Gabe looked at her, his expression unreadable. We survive, he said simply. It was a harsh, cold truth, but Sarah knew he was right. Survival was all they could think about now. It was the only thing that mattered. As they sat there, the storm continued to rage, but Sarah felt a small flicker of hope. They were alive, and they had each other. That was enough for now. Gabe stood up first, his movements fluid and decisive. We'll rest here for a while, he said. But we can't stay too long. Once the storm clears, we move. Sarah nodded again, her gaze returning to the floodwaters below. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time since the storm began, she felt like maybe, just maybe, they could make it through this. Together. The rain had finally begun to subside, but the floodwaters remained relentless, their surging force leaving no mercy in their wake. Gabe had already packed what little gear they had, and Sarah, though exhausted, was ready to move again. She watched as he stood at the edge of the ridge, his eyes fixed on the distance. The storm had done its damage, but now they had to survive the aftermath. They had to keep moving, even though everything inside her screamed to rest. Gabe turned toward her, his expression unreadable, and motioned for her to follow. We need to get to higher ground before the next wave of rain hits, he said, his voice steady, almost calm, like he had seen this all before. Sarah nodded and stood, her legs shaky but determined. She had no idea where they would go, but she trusted Gabe, and that was enough. The ridge was a temporary shelter, and they couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. The rain had already flooded much of the trail they needed to follow, and the next 10 miles to the town Gabe had mentioned seemed more daunting with each passing moment. But she knew there was no turning back. They had to keep moving forward. How far is the town again? Sarah asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Gabe didn't look at her as he began to move, stepping carefully over the slippery ground. 10 miles, he said briefly. We can make it. We'll move quickly while the rain's down. Sarah followed behind him, trying to keep her footing as they moved away from the ridge and down toward the next stretch of land. The trees above them had lost much of their leaves in the storm, and the ground was littered with branches, rocks, and debris from the flood. The landscape looked foreign, unrecognizable, as if the storm had wiped away the familiar world they once knew. As they pressed on, Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. Every step felt like it took them further from the life they had known. She glanced at Gabe, wondering if he was feeling the same uncertainty, but his face remained a mask of focus and determination. He moved like a man who had accepted the chaos of the world and learned to survive in it. She wished she could be more like him, more sure, more capable of handling whatever came their way. But she had never been in a situation like this before. She was out of her element. "Gabe," she said, breaking the silence. "How do you stay so focused, so calm?" He didn't slow down, but he gave her a sidelong glance. "You don't have a choice," he replied quietly. "You either keep moving or you die. Fear doesn't change that." His words hit Sarah hard, and for a moment, she wasn't sure what to say. She had feared for her life since the storm had started, but hearing him say it so plainly made the reality hit harder. Gabe wasn't just surviving the storm. He was living with it, moving forward no matter what. It made her realize that maybe that was all they could do, move forward, no matter how uncertain it felt. "How do you know we'll make it to the town?" Sarah asked, her voice a little shaky. Gabe didn't answer right away. He was too focused on the path ahead. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. "I don't know," he said. "But if we stop now, we'll be stuck. The only way out is to keep going." Sarah wasn't sure if that was meant to reassure her, but it did in some strange way. At least he had a plan, even if it was just to keep moving. They walked in silence for a while, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the wet ground. The sky was clearing up slowly, but the damage had been done. The flood had changed everything. The trees they passed had been torn apart by the force of the water, and the path ahead was barely recognizable. At times, they had to navigate around large patches of standing water that had yet to recede. It felt like the world was a completely different place, and Sarah wasn't sure how to fit into it anymore. It was hard to remember what life had been like before the flood, before the storm. Was that even a part of the same world anymore? But Gabe didn't seem to be bothered by these thoughts. He just moved forward, like everything else was secondary to the one goal in front of them. He was the anchor in the chaos. When they reached a small rise in the trail, Gabe stopped and looked back at Sarah. "We need to cross the next stretch fast," he said, his voice low. "The floodwaters are receding, but they're still dangerous." Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath. She didn't want to think about the water again, but there was no way around it. They couldn't afford to let the flood catch them. Gabe moved first, crossing a section of flooded land with ease, his steps sure and quick. Sarah followed, her heart pounding in her chest. The water was moving fast, but it wasn't deep enough to drown them if they kept moving. Still, every second felt like it was pushing them toward a danger they couldn't escape. She reached the other side, her legs trembling with the effort, and looked up at Gabe. He was already several steps ahead of her, still focused, still moving. She knew he was right. There was no choice but to keep going. They couldn't afford to stop. As they pressed on, the sun finally began to peek through the clouds, casting weak light over the drenched landscape. The storm was over, but the journey was far from finished. The town was still 10 miles away, and who knew what else lay ahead. But they would face it together. And that was enough. The sun was barely peeking through the clouds, but the storm had already done its worst. Sarah and Gabe had been walking for hours now, the trail narrowing as they moved deeper into the wilderness. The floodwaters had started to recede, but the ground was still slick and treacherous, and the path ahead was uncertain. They had come a long way since the storm first hit, and Sarah had no idea how much farther they had to go before they reached the town. But one thing was certain. Gabe's presence was the only thing keeping her from succumbing to the overwhelming fear that clawed at her chest. His steady pace, his unwavering focus, had become a lifeline she couldn't let go of. They had to keep moving. Gabe's eyes scanned the path ahead, his hand resting on the rifle at his side. He had barely spoken since they left the ridge, his mind clearly occupied with the task of survival. Sarah, on the other hand, found herself questioning everything. How they would make it through, where the next step would take them, and what would happen once they reached the town. But she didn't ask these questions aloud. She knew Gabe didn't have the answers. and the only thing that mattered now was moving forward. How much farther? Sarah asked, her voice hoarse from the dust and exhaustion. Gabe didn't look at her, his eyes focused ahead as he answered. Not much. We're getting closer. Sarah nodded, though she had no way of knowing if that was true. The landscape around them looked the same as it had for the past few hours. Endless mud, broken trees, and flood-soaked earth. She couldn't tell if they were any closer to their destination or if they were simply walking in circles. We'll have to cross the next stretch fast, Gabe said, interrupting her thoughts. Sarah looked up, alarmed. What do you mean? Gabe pointed to a section of the trail ahead, where the ground sloped down toward a swollen creek. That's where the water's been rising the most, he said. We need to make it past that before the next wave of rain hits. We don't have much time. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't realized how dangerous the situation still was. The floodwaters may have receded, but they weren't out of danger yet. Can we make it? She asked, her voice shaky. Gabe's expression was unreadable. We don't have a choice. They moved quickly toward the creek, the sound of rushing water growing louder with each step. Gabe led the way, his steps sure and steady, while Sarah followed closely behind, her thoughts racing. The creek was swollen, the water moving fast, and she couldn't help but feel a knot form in her stomach. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to cross without getting swept away. Gabe paused at the edge of the creek, scanning the water. We'll need to cross at the shallowest point, he said, his voice calm, though there was a tightness to it. He seemed to be calculating every move, every step. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had never been a strong swimmer, and the thought of wading through the fast-moving water was terrifying. But Gabe was already moving forward, and she knew she had no choice but to follow. Stay close, Gabe said, as he carefully stepped into the creek, the water rushing over his boots. Sarah stepped forward hesitantly, feeling the cold water bite at her legs. She looked at Gabe's back, his steady movements somehow calming her own frantic thoughts. The water was deeper than she expected, the current stronger. It pushed against her with every step, making it harder to keep her footing. But Gabe kept moving, his eyes never leaving the path ahead. He reached a large rock in the middle of the creek and paused to steady himself. Grab the rock, he called to Sarah. She reached out and grasped the rock, holding on tightly as the water surged around her. With Gabe's help, they made it to the other side of the creek. They were both panting from the exertion, but they had made it. Gabe turned to her, his eyes hard with focus. We keep moving, he said, his voice firm. Sarah nodded, though her legs felt like they might give out any moment. But she couldn't stop. Not now. They had come this far, and the town was still waiting. As they moved on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty that clung to her. She had no idea what would happen when they finally reached the town, or if they would even make it there. But she had to keep moving, just like Gabe said. The rain had stopped, but the damage had been done. The world around them had been torn apart, and Sarah wasn't sure if anything would ever be the same. But Gabe was still there, still leading her, and that was enough. They couldn't afford to stop now. The flood had come and gone, but their journey wasn't over yet. Gabe's steady presence, his silent strength, had become the anchor she needed in this storm of uncertainty. And as they moved forward, she knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The sun was now high in the sky, though the clouds still lingered, casting long shadows over the mud-soaked earth. The storm had passed, but the damage was evident. The trail they had been following was barely recognizable, the floodwaters having washed away any sense of familiar landmarks. The air felt heavy, still thick with the remnants of the rain, and the weight of their journey hung on Sarah's shoulders like an invisible burden. Gabe, however, moved with the same quiet determination he had shown from the start. He hadn't said much since they crossed the creek, but his presence alone gave Sarah the strength to keep moving. As they approached a small rise in the land, Gabe stopped, his eyes scanning the horizon. Sarah looked around, but all she could see was a vast, broken landscape, trees knocked over, branches scattered like matchsticks, and the remnants of the flood's destruction stretching as far as the eye could see. Gabe's gaze turned toward her, his face unreadable. We're getting close, he said. We need to keep up the pace. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure how much longer she could go on at this speed. The constant walking, the never-ending exhaustion, was starting to take its toll. But she couldn't stop now, Not when they were so close. Not when there was still a chance they could make it to safety. How much farther? Sarah asked, her voice quiet but filled with urgency. Gabe didn't answer right away, his eyes still fixed on the distance. Finally, he spoke. A few more miles. But we need to stay ahead of the floodwaters. He paused, then looked at her with a gaze that softened just slightly. Don't worry. We'll make it. His words should have been reassuring, but instead, they only raised more questions. How did he know? How could he be so sure when they were in the middle of a world that had been torn apart by the storm? But Sarah didn't ask. She just kept moving, her eyes fixed on Gabe's back. She knew he had more experience in these situations, and if he said they would make it, then maybe that was all she could rely on. They pressed on for another hour, the path winding its way through the now muddy trail. Gabe was still leading the way, his steps confident and steady. Sarah, on the other hand, was beginning to feel the weight of the journey in her body. Her legs ached, her chest felt tight with every breath, and she found it harder and harder to keep up with Gabe's pace. She wanted to ask him to slow down, but something inside her told her to keep going. She had no choice but to follow him. They were getting closer to the town, or so Gabe said. But the flood had taken so much that Sarah couldn't be sure of anything anymore. How could she trust that the town would still be there? The flood had changed everything. Gabe, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. What if the town's gone? What if the flood swept it away? Gabe stopped abruptly, turning to face her. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that told Sarah he wasn't as confident as he had been. The town is still there, he said firmly, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. The flood didn't reach it. We just need to make it through these last few miles. Sarah wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that the town would be a place of safety, a place where they could finally rest. But doubt lingered in the back of her mind. What if it was too late? What if they were walking into a place that had already been destroyed? The thought made her stomach turn. Do you think anyone's still there? She asked, her voice shaking. Gabe's eyes softened as he looked at her, and for the first time since they had started this journey, he didn't look like the stoic, unshakable man he had been. He looked tired. I hope so, he said, his voice quiet. I really do. Sarah nodded, trying to push away the dread that was creeping up on her. She didn't want to think about the possibility of reaching the town only to find it abandoned, destroyed, or worse. But she had no choice. They had to keep going. The only thing that mattered now was reaching the town, no matter what they found there. As they continued their journey, the landscape started to change. The trees became sparse, the earth drier, and Sarah could feel the air shift as they moved toward higher ground. The floodwaters were still a threat, but it seemed like they were slowly beginning to leave the area. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Sarah a flicker of hope. They were close. She could feel it. And then, in the distance, she saw it. A small group of buildings. The town. Sarah's heart leaped in her chest, and she quickened her pace. Gabe noticed and glanced over at her. He said nothing, but there was a slight change in his step too. They were almost there. As they neared the town, the buildings grew clearer, small wooden structures that seemed to be holding up against the storm's aftermath. There were signs of damage, but nothing like what Sarah had feared. They weren't too late. The town was still standing. But even so, the silence that hung in the air was unsettling. No voices, no movement, just the quiet after the storm. Gabe took the lead, walking ahead with purpose. Sarah followed, unsure of what they would find. They had made it this far. Now all they could do was hope that someone, anyone, was still there to offer them the safety they so desperately needed. As Sarah and Gabe approached the town, the silence became almost oppressive. The buildings stood like ghosts, their wooden frames battered by the storm, but still standing. There were no voices, no signs of life. The wind had died down, and the air was still thick with the remnants of the flood. It was an eerie stillness, one that made Sarah's heart beat faster, her breath shallow as she took in the scene before her. The town seemed abandoned, the streets empty, with only the occasional wreckage of a cart or piece of debris to hint at what had once been here. Gabe's pace never slowed, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to her. Was this what they had been fighting for? A town left to the mercy of the flood, now empty and lifeless? As they walked deeper into the heart of the town, Gabe turned to her, his expression unreadable. Stay close, he said, his voice low. We don't know what we're walking into. Sarah nodded, her legs aching with every step, but she couldn't stop now. They had come too far, through too much. "I'm with you," she said, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to reassure him or herself. They continued walking, passing the once bustling storefronts that were now hollow and quiet. A few signs hung limply above doorways, swinging slightly in the breeze. The flood had taken everything, the town's life, its spirit, and left behind only the ruins. Sarah tried to keep her mind focused, but the sight of everything destroyed made it hard to push away the thoughts of what might have been. Was anyone left? Were there any survivors? What would they do if the town had been wiped out completely? Gabe stopped in front of a small saloon, the windows shattered and the door hanging open. He motioned for Sarah to stay behind him, and with a nod, she followed him as they carefully approached the entrance. Gabe pushed the door open slowly, his hand resting on the rifle at his side. The inside of the saloon was dark, save for the faint light filtering in through the broken windows. It smelled of damp wood, stale air, and something else, something metallic that made Sarah's stomach churn. Gabe stepped in first, his movements cautious. He scanned the room, taking in the overturned furniture and the remnants of whatever had once been a gathering place for the townspeople. But there was no one there. No signs of life, no bodies, no sound except for the creaking of the buildings settling in the quiet. Sarah took a hesitant step forward, her eyes searching every corner, every shadow. She didn't know what she expected to find, but the emptiness felt wrong, unnatural. She felt a cold dread creep over her, but Gabe's presence beside her steadied her. "They're gone," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked up at him, her heart sinking. "Gone?" she repeated, her voice trembling. Gabe nodded, his face hardening as he glanced around. "I don't think they made it through the flood," he said, his words heavy with unspoken grief. Sarah's chest tightened at the thought. The flood had taken so much already, but to think that it had taken the people too, it felt like too much to bear. She swallowed hard, trying to hold herself together. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Gabe's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Sarah saw something soft in his gaze, a flicker of the humanity he had kept hidden behind his tough exterior. "We keep going," he said, his voice steady. "We survive. We don't have any other choice." His words were simple, but they hit her with the weight of their truth. She knew he was right. They had made it this far. They had fought the storm, the flood, the uncertainty, and they had survived. But surviving wasn't enough anymore. They needed a purpose. They needed something to fight for, something to hold on to. And for the first time, Sarah realized that maybe it wasn't the town they were fighting for, it was each other. Gabe moved toward the back of the saloon, his steps measured, and Sarah followed closely behind. She wasn't sure what he was looking for, but part of her hoped he had found some sign of life, some indication that the town wasn't entirely lost. But as they moved further into the saloon, the sense of emptiness deepened. There was nothing here. No survivors. No refuge. Just the hollow remnants of a place that had once been alive. They stood in silence for a moment, taking it all in. Gabe's expression had hardened again, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, something she couldn't quite read. "We need to leave," he said, his voice firm. "The flood might not be over yet. We need to find higher ground, somewhere safe." Sarah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She wasn't ready to leave this place, but she knew Gabe was right. The storm might have passed, but the danger wasn't over. They had to keep moving. Together, they left the saloon, stepping out into the silent, flooded town. Sarah felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, but as she glanced at Gabe, she knew they weren't alone. They would survive. Together, they would find a way forward. The town was as silent as a ghost town should be. Gabe and Sarah had left the saloon behind, stepping into the streets that were barely recognizable. Floodwaters had carved their mark on the town, leaving it in disarray. Buildings that once stood proudly were now broken, the debris from the storm scattered across the streets like remnants of a past life. Sarah felt the weight of the silence pressing in on her. The air was thick with the aftertaste of the storm, damp, heavy, and unsettling. She glanced over at Gabe, who was still moving with purpose, his gaze sharp as he scanned the area. It was as if the storm hadn't touched him at all, as if nothing could break his calm exterior. But Sarah saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hands tightened around the rifle at his side. He was just as affected by the destruction as she was, but he wasn't showing it. They moved through the town, making their way toward the edge, the path ahead uncertain. It felt wrong to be here, walking through a place that was supposed to be full of life, but now felt like a tomb. Gabe's footsteps were steady, his focus never wavering. Sarah could barely keep up, her legs still weak from the long trek, her body worn down by the days of nonstop movement. The thought of finding shelter was growing more urgent with each step. She glanced at Gabe again, wondering how much longer they would keep walking, how much longer they would keep searching for something that might not even exist anymore. She had to ask, what if we don't find anyone? Her voice was barely a whisper, carried away by the stillness around them. Gabe didn't hesitate, his voice calm but resolute. Then we'll survive on our own, he said simply. We've made it this far. We'll keep going. Sarah swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling in. She had hoped for more, hoped that they would find some sign of life in the town, some hint that they weren't alone in this wasteland. But Gabe was right. They couldn't afford to wait for others. They couldn't afford to depend on anyone else. It was just them, and that had to be enough. As they neared the outskirts of town, Sarah could feel the shift in the air. The floodwaters had reached their peak, and now they were beginning to recede. The town was still standing, but the damage was evident. There was no sign of life anywhere, no movement, no sounds. It was as if the world had been paused in time, waiting for something to happen. Gabe led them toward a small rise in the land. From there, Sarah could see the full scope of the damage. The town's main street had been completely flooded, the buildings that lined it now submerged in water. Only the rooftops and the occasional sign poked above the surface, reminders of a life that had once been vibrant. Gabe stopped at the top of the rise, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had a look on his face that Sarah couldn't quite read, but she knew it wasn't good. We can't stay here, he said, his voice low. The flood's still moving. We need to get to higher ground. Sarah nodded, but her heart sank. She didn't want to keep moving. She wanted to stop, to rest, to find some semblance of normalcy. But she couldn't argue with Gabe. She had to trust him. Where do we go? She asked, her voice barely audible. Gabe looked at her for a long moment, his eyes softening just a fraction. There's a ridge about 2 miles out, he said. We can make it there. It'll be safer. Sarah didn't ask any more questions. She just nodded, letting Gabe take the lead once again. They moved quickly, their steps synchronized as they made their way toward the ridge. As they walked, Sarah couldn't help but think of the people who had once lived here. People who had once called this place home. Where were they now? What had happened to them? The silence was overwhelming, and the absence of life felt suffocating. She glanced at Gabe, wondering if he was thinking the same thing. But Gabe didn't show any sign of it. He kept moving, his eyes focused on the horizon, his mind seemingly miles ahead. Sarah followed, the weight of the storm still heavy on her heart. But for the first time, she felt a sense of determination rise within her. They had made it this far. They were still alive. And as long as they had each other, they could keep going. They reached the ridge 2 hours later, the landscape now more familiar, though it was still scarred by the flood's destruction. Gabe stopped at the top, looking out over the land. The town was far behind them now, swallowed by the storm and the flood. The world ahead was uncertain, but it was theirs to face. Gabe turned to Sarah, his eyes calm, though there was a trace of something else in them. We keep moving, he said, his voice firm. We don't stop. Sarah didn't answer. She didn't need to. She knew what they had to do. They had to survive. And as long as they had each other, that was all that mattered. They reached the top of the ridge, the wind biting at their faces as they surveyed the land below. The view was stark and haunting. Vast stretches of broken land, trees uprooted, and the last remnants of the floodwaters lingering like ghosts across the valley. Gabe paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon, his jaw set with quiet determination. Sarah stood beside him, the weight of their journey pressing down on her. Her muscles ached, her body felt worn, and every step they had taken felt like it was slowly draining the last bit of strength from her. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Gabe looked over at her, his expression unreadable as always. He had become the steady force that kept her going, his silent strength pulling her through when the fear and doubt threatened to overwhelm her. We need to keep going, he said, breaking the silence between them. His voice was low, but firm. The town's still a few miles ahead. We don't stop now. Sarah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. It had been days since the storm first hit, and she had thought that once they reached the town, they would be safe. But with every step, the uncertainty grew. Would the town still be there? Would anyone be there to help them? Or would they find nothing but more devastation? "Do you think we'll find anyone?" she asked quietly, her voice almost lost in the wind. Gabe didn't hesitate. "We have to." It wasn't just a statement, it was a promise. A promise that no matter what, they would survive. Together, they pressed on, moving quickly as the path narrowed and the terrain grew more treacherous. The floodwaters had caused so much damage that it was hard to tell what was natural and what had been altered by the storm. The trees they passed looked as if they had been torn from the earth, their roots exposed, their branches broken and scattered across the trail. Every now and then, they would pass what remained of a building. Half-collapsed walls, roofs torn away, debris scattered like it had been tossed around by a giant hand. But there were no signs of life. No one to greet them. No sounds except the wind and the occasional call of a bird that had managed to survive the storm. Sarah's heart began to race with each step. What if they were too late? What if everyone had already left? Or worse, what if there was no one left at all? She had to fight to push the thoughts away. They had come this far. They couldn't turn back now. Gabe was still moving ahead, his eyes focused on the path, never looking back. He was a man of few words, but there was something about the way he moved that gave Sarah a sense of calm, a sense that they would make it through this, no matter what. As they moved forward, the landscape began to change again. The floodwaters were no longer a constant threat, but the land was still scarred by the storm's violence. It was clear that no one had been here for a while, no signs of anyone living or working. It felt like they were walking through a forgotten world, a world that had been abandoned by time itself. Sarah's legs were beginning to feel like lead. Every step was an effort, and the cold had settled deep into her bones. She wanted to stop, just for a moment, to catch her breath. But she knew that wasn't an option. Not yet. Gabe glanced back at her and seemed to sense her exhaustion. "We'll rest when we make it," he said, his voice steady. "Just a little further." Sarah nodded, though her body protested. She pushed forward, step by step, the promise of rest keeping her going. They finally reached the edge of the town as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows over the ruins. The streets were still eerily quiet, the buildings standing like empty shells, their windows shattered, their doors hanging ajar. But there was something different now, something that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. A figure appeared in the distance, moving slowly through the wreckage. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make out the figure. It was a man, his silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of destruction. Gabe stopped and raised his hand, motioning for Sarah to stay behind him. He stepped forward cautiously, his eyes fixed on the stranger. The man saw them and paused, his face hidden in shadow. "Who are you?" Gabe called out, his voice firm but not hostile. The man didn't move at first. For a moment, there was only the wind and the distant sound of water. Then the man took a step forward, his voice rough but clear. "I'm the last one left." Sarah's heart raced. "The last one left? What happened here?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man paused again, looking at both of them for a long moment. "Flood took most of the town," he said. "Others tried to leave, but not everyone made it." His words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She had feared this, but hearing it out loud was worse than she had imagined. Gabe's eyes softened slightly, but his expression remained guarded. "Are you alone?" he asked. The man nodded slowly. "Everyone's gone. I've been here since the floodwaters receded." Gabe motioned for Sarah to approach, and she did, her legs still shaky but her determination driving her forward. The man didn't move, his eyes distant, as if the weight of what he had seen had left him hollow. "Is there any place safe here?" Sarah asked. The man hesitated for a moment before answering, his voice barely a whisper. "Safe? I don't know about that. But I can show you where I've been hiding. It's not much, but it's better than nothing." Gabe looked at Sarah, his face unreadable. She met his gaze, and for the first time since they had started this journey, she felt a small glimmer of hope. They had made it this far. Maybe, just maybe, they would make it through this too. The man led them through the remains of the town, his steps slow and deliberate, his face shadowed with the weight of grief. Gabe stayed close to Sarah, his hand never straying far from his rifle. But there was no threat here, just emptiness. The man's name, he had told them, was Peter. He had been the town's blacksmith before the flood, now the last of the survivors. As they moved through the wreckage, Sarah couldn't help but notice the signs of life that had once thrived here. Broken windows, shattered doors, signs of homes and families that had been destroyed. It was all gone, swept away in the surge of the flood. It felt like an entire world had been erased. They passed what remained of the local general store, the shelves now empty, the wooden walls soaked and warped from the water's wrath. The streets were eerily silent, and as they walked, Sarah realized how alone they truly were. Peter led them toward a small, squat building on the outskirts of town, its roof half collapsed and windows boarded up. "This is where I've been staying," he said, his voice flat. "Not much, but it keeps the rain off." Gabe nodded and walked ahead, ducking through the low doorway first. Sarah followed, her mind still racing. She didn't know what she had expected when they arrived, but the sight of the town's last refuge wasn't it. It was a far cry from the home she had imagined. Simple, dark, and cold, but it was shelter. That's all that mattered now. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with the scent of damp wood and earth. There was a small fire pit in the center of the room, a few tattered blankets scattered on the floor, and a rusted stove in the corner that Peter had obviously tried to keep in working order. It was a place to rest, but little more. "Make yourselves at home," Peter said, his tone distant. He moved to the corner and sat down on one of the blankets, not bothering to make eye contact. Gabe looked at Sarah, then at Peter, and nodded. "It'll do for now." Sarah stood at the entrance for a moment, taking in their new surroundings. The thought of staying here, in this shell of a town, felt strange. They had come so far, fought so hard to survive, and now it felt like they were taking refuge in a place that had already given up. "We'll need to figure out our next move," Gabe said, breaking the silence. He was already studying the layout of the room, his mind clearly working on their next step. "We can't stay here forever." Sarah nodded, though the weight of exhaustion was beginning to settle in her bones. Her body ached from the constant movement, from the strain of the past few days. She was so tired, so ready to rest, but Gabe was right. They couldn't afford to stop yet. "Do you think there are more survivors out there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Peter shifted slightly, but didn't look up. "There might be," he said, his voice rough. "But if there are, they've either left or they're hiding. I haven't seen anyone else since the flood. Most of the town tried to get out, but..." His voice trailed off, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "What happened?" Sarah asked softly, her heart heavy with the pain she knew Peter had endured. "The river just came in like a wall," Peter said, his eyes distant. "No one was prepared. The water rose so fast, the town was gone before anyone could escape. Some of the families..." He paused, unable to continue. The words he couldn't say were clear enough. Families had been swept away, homes destroyed, lives lost. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to push the images from her mind. She couldn't afford to dwell on the destruction. They had to keep going. Gabe stood up and walked over to Peter, his gaze hard but respectful. "We'll stay here for the night. Tomorrow, we'll see if we can find any other survivors." Peter gave a stiff nod, but it was clear he wasn't sure if there was anyone left. If there is anyone, they'll be hard to find. The flood took everything. Sarah sat down on the floor, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. She was so tired. The idea of moving again tomorrow, of trying to find someone who might be left, felt like an impossible task. She just wanted to rest, to have a moment of peace, but she knew that wasn't an option. Not yet. "We'll make it," Gabe said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. He turned toward her, his face softening just a bit. "We've come this far. We're not stopping now." Sarah met his gaze, her heart heavy with the uncertainty of it all. They were in a place where survival was the only thing that mattered. And as long as they had each other, that would be enough to keep them going. "Tomorrow," she said softly. "We keep moving tomorrow." Gabe nodded, and with that, they settled into the small space, the fire crackling softly in the corner. As Sarah lay down, her thoughts began to swirl, but she knew one thing for sure. They couldn't afford to stop. The town might be gone, the flood might have taken everything, but they still had a chance. And that was all they could hold on to. They would survive, no matter what. Together. The morning light filtered weakly through the cracks in the walls, casting long shadows across the small, makeshift shelter where Sarah and Gabe had spent the night. The silence of the town still lingered, heavy and oppressive, and as Sarah lay there, the weight of everything they had been through settled on her chest. The storm had passed, the floodwaters were receding, but the world around them had been forever changed. The small fire in the corner had long since burned out, and the cold was beginning to creep back in. She had barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. What was left of the world they knew? Was there any hope of finding others, of rebuilding what had been lost? She could hear Gabe moving about quietly, preparing for the day ahead. He was always the first to rise, always the first to act. It was his strength, his determination, that had kept them alive. But Sarah couldn't shake the sense of helplessness that clung to her. Gabe had been right about one thing: they couldn't stop. They had to keep moving, keep searching. But as she sat up and pulled on her damp clothes, she wasn't sure if they were looking for anything anymore, or if they were just trying to outrun the ghosts of the past. Gabe turned toward her, his face impassive as always, but there was something in his eyes today, something softer, something that made Sarah's heart tighten in her chest. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice low but steady. Sarah nodded, though part of her wanted to argue, wanted to say that they had been moving long enough. "I know," she replied quietly. "Let's go." Gabe didn't say anything else. He was already packing up their few belongings, his movements quick and efficient. Sarah watched him for a moment, her mind still clouded with doubt, but she knew better than to question him now. He had become the anchor that kept them grounded, and without him, she would have been lost. As they stepped outside into the empty town, the morning air was cool and damp, still heavy with the remnants of the storm. The town looked even more desolate in the daylight, the damage clearer now, broken buildings, debris scattered everywhere, the streets eerily silent. There was no sign of life, no movement. It felt like a world frozen in time, a place that had been forgotten. They walked in silence, the crunch of their footsteps on the wet earth the only sound. Sarah's thoughts drifted back to the man they had met yesterday, Peter. He had been the last one left, the only survivor in the town. But now, even he seemed distant, disconnected, lost in his own grief. How could they move forward when everything they had known was gone? "Do you think there's anyone else out there?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. Gabe didn't answer right away. He seemed to be lost in his own thoughts, his eyes scanning the wreckage of the town. Finally, he spoke. "Maybe," he said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "But we can't wait for them. We have to keep going." Sarah nodded, even though the uncertainty gnawed at her. She had never been one to give up, but this felt different. Everything was different. "What if we can't find anyone?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Gabe stopped walking and turned to face her. For a moment, their eyes met, and Sarah saw something there. A flicker of vulnerability, a crack in his usually unshakable exterior. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar determination she had come to rely on. "Then we keep surviving," he said quietly. "We have each other. That's all we need." Sarah felt the weight of his words settle on her, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe in them. They had made it this far. They had fought through the storm, through the flood, through the uncertainty. And they were still here, still alive. That had to be enough. They continued walking through the ghost town, the road ahead unclear, but always moving forward. As they reached the outskirts of the town, Gabe paused once more, looking out over the landscape. The flood had changed everything, but in that moment, Sarah saw something else in the way he held himself. Hope, a determination to keep fighting, no matter what. She felt a small flicker of that same hope stirring inside her, a spark that had been buried beneath the weight of everything they had lost. "Let's go," Gabe said, his voice steady once more. Sarah nodded and followed him, her steps slower but more certain. They were together. That was enough. The world might have changed, but they would keep moving, keep surviving. Together. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew one thing. They had each other, and that was all they needed to face whatever came next.